This month on the Medicinal Herbs podcast from Holistic Matters, we're joined by one of our favorite guests, Professor Kerry Bone. Our discussion will include how we categorize and understand the various medicinal herbs that impact the immune system, including astragalus, ashwagandha, and echinacea root. Well, we want to welcome Professor Kerry Bone back to our podcast. And we're talking about a very relevant topic that maybe some of us wish we weren't still talking about, but the immune system and our need really to make sure that we are appropriately, supporting our immune system. We're going to give you just kind of some background, and then we're going to talk about some herbs and some clinical applications of it. So, Kerry, let's dive in and let's first talk about if you could outline these three key categories within immune herbs and how they affect the immune system.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So, a lot of people, when they think about immune herbs, they think, this herb just stimulates the immune system in some vague way. They're not really sure, but hey, it might help me not get an infection, that's kind of thing. But in reality, what we've learned from application in clinical practice, and indeed the research and the traditional knowledge, that there are, in fact, what I would say three categories of immune herbs. And each one is applied differently, and each one has different caveats about its use and of course, different benefits. So firstly, we have what I call the immune tonics. Then we have what we can call the immune enhancers. You can even use the term immune modulators there. And then we have the stimulators. So firstly, let's look at the tonics. What do they do? And the tonic herbs basically help boost immunity where it's low, where it's deficient. So someone who's depleted, it might be due to chronic illness. It may be due to their general constitution. It could be they're recuperating from something, but for whatever reason, or they're just stressed and overtired, their immune system is depleted, and it's depleted in an ongoing manner. And that's when the immune tonics are called in. Then we have the enhancers or the modulators, and they're called in when someone who is basically healthy just needs extra help. Get over an infection, prevent an infection happening, even, I believe, balance out the immune system in an autoimmune disease. And then we have the stimulators, and there are very few of these. They're generally toxic, and they are the ones that really just do in a perhaps non-specific fashion, just rev up the immune response. So these are herbs that need to be used very carefully. And I think what's often happened when people write or think about immune herbs is they conflate enhancers versus stimulators. And they say, oh, you can't, for example, use echinacea in autoimmune disease, but echinacea is immune enhancer in my view, not a stimulator. And therefore it's not going to, in an indiscriminate manner, rev up the immune system in someone with autoimmune disease who in some compartments of their immunity, their immune system is already revved up.
So if we really think about these different categories, right? And you mentioned one like herb that falls into echinacea, right? And
Yes.
often, as you said, it often gets confused. But what are some of the other herbs, and which categories do you see them falling into?
Okay. So firstly, let me clarify. When I talk about echinacea, I'm only talking about echinacea root. We have the
Right.
later European use of the aerial parts, and that probably has different properties, but I'm very much focused on the traditional use of echinacea by the First Nation people of Canada and the United States, and that was to uh, use the root, and especially the root of these species that have those tingling components. They tingle in your mouth, called the alchemides or alkylamides. So take it for this podcast that going forward, when I mention echinacea, I'm really talking about the root, and from those particular two species that are rich in alkylamides, which are Echinacea angustifolia and Echinacea purpurea. Now, to your question, what herbs fall into these categories? And I might add that there is a fourth category, and that's, if we like, the immune suppressors. And generally, those herbs are toxic as well. But there are some exceptions there. So I might actually add that category, having thought about it, of the suppressors, because they do have a role, for example, in inflammation and autoimmune disease. But let's start with the tonics. So
Mhm.
so these are when the immune system is depleted, and that depletion may even show up on a blood test. For example, white cell count might be down, or one particular compartment of the white cell count might be down. So the key herb there is astragalus. But I also use the herb ashwagandha in that context. And indeed, any of our tonic and adaptogenic herbs can fall into that immune tonic category. There's an intimate relationship between the stress response and the immune system.
Mhm.
And it means that herbs that work on the stress response also generally have beneficial effects on the immune system, and that's been shown.
Mhm.
It's been shown for ashwagandha. It's been shown for eleuthero. It's been shown for Korean ginseng, Panax ginseng. Um, so they're the tonics. The tonics are generally the herbs we know as adaptogenics and tonics. They're the immune tonics. Uh, uh, but with the particular one, uh, astragalus, and there is one some of our listeners may be familiar with from the Ayurvedic tradition, known as Tinospora. So they're the immune tonics. Then we have the enhancers. So they make the immune system work better. And there's a couple of key ones there. The first one, of course, is echinacea root, as I've said. And another key one is andrographis. So what's the difference between the two? Well, some would argue that it's fairly academic. Both would help prevent an infection and indeed accelerate recovery from infection. There is another one, again, from the Ayurvedic tradition, which is known as Tulsi. I see it that way, or holy basil. So that to me is another example of immune enhancer. And we can also say that probably in certain contexts, cat's claw acts in that way. That's the South American herb, and the medicinal mushrooms act
Mhm.
in that way. And I think one of the key properties about the immune enhancers that's often misunderstood is they only act as much as is needed. So they're not going to indiscriminately stir up the immune system and wear it out, or they're not going to indiscriminately stir up the immune system in an autoimmune disease and make the person worse. And I have to say, I have now getting on to 37 years of clinical experience in that regard, and I've not seen it. Some people say they've seen it. That's fine, but I've not seen it. Maybe I don't know what the quality of the herbs they're using or what plant parts they're using, but not in my experience. And then we have the stimulators, and there are a few of those, but most of them we don't talk about because they're toxic. But there is one that we do tend to use. It can be toxic if you have too much of it, and that's phytolacca or poke root. And I see that as a more indiscriminate stimulator of the immune system. So we need to be very respectful. Poke root has a role, but we need to be very respectful of that herb and use it sparingly and cautiously. Now, in the case of poke root, if you look at the studies where people have actually been poisoned, that inadvertently they've had too much of it, what we see is their lymphocyte counts, especially the T lymphocytes go up substantially. So that's an example of how it can rev up the uh, immune response. And that's because poke root and again, some of these other stimulating herbs um, contain substances known as mitogens, mitogens, and they are indiscriminate stimulators, especially of the lymphocyte category. And then I have mentioned this fourth category, so I should talk about it. We could call them immune suppressors. Some of them are immune suppressors. For example, there's the Chinese thunder god vine, which has gone into many clinical trials in autoimmune disease and been successful. And it has all the same side effects of an immune, you know, suppressing drug, because that's what it does. And most of the trials, of course, in which has been successful are things like rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune diseases. But there are some gentler herbs that are perhaps more anti-inflammatory and just slightly immune depressing, and they can be quite useful in autoimmunity. And one example would be the Ayurvedic herb Hemidesmus, and another example would be the Chinese herb Buplurum.
So that's kind of a lot to take in, right?
Yeah,
Many
yeah,
herbs, right? Such interesting kind of like thought process into it. I really think it was helpful. The thing that I really appreciated in kind of the immune tonics and the role of both, you know, the adaptogens plus their immune role. And I mean, that
yeah,
really, makes sense, right? We want to
yes,
alter that HPA axis because it does have such a role in inflammation and immune response. So
it
as we
does.
think about that, how do we apply that in a clinical way in practice?
Yeah, so someone comes to see you, they're generally a healthy person, but they're concerned about, infections going around, and they just want to, fine tune their immune response. So I might, for example, give them echinacea root and say, take this on a daily basis as a preventative to enhance your immune response. And but if you feel you're getting ill, then take it with antigraphis, because I see antigraphis as better after the fact of an infection, and I see echinacea better root as better before the infection. So that's an example. But if that person comes to you and says, I don't know what's the matter with me, I seem to catch everything that's going, my immune system just seems shot, I'm tired, I'm not sleeping well, then they're much more for um, the first category, the immune tonics. So I'll prescribe astragalus and ashwagandha and eleuthero, for example, to those people. But I might also give them, say, some antigraphis and echinacea to take after the fact when they catch an infection. So I'll say to them, I'm very sorry that these names are similar and it can be confusing, but I want you to take the first herb that begins with astragalus, before you get infections, but then you stop that. And when you get an infection, I want you to take andrographis, another A, similar sounding names, but and switch that way. And then when we have someone with an autoimmune disease, I believe that, and I'll get on to this perhaps in more detail soon, that we need to enhance the immune response in one compartment, but also calm it down in another. So I will prescribe them echinacea to enhance their immune response, and we can discuss why there. and but I'll also give them maybe Romani and hemidesmus to, in another compartment, calm down their immune response. And then if we look at uh, the stimulators like poke root, well, as I said, I'll reserve that very sparingly. But if, say, someone has a chronic bacterial infection that hasn't been resolvable and they really just need to rev up their immune response, and I won't use it on its own, I'll use it in combination with the other immune herbs we've discussed. I might throw in some poke root there, or for example, someone who's needs heightened immune surveillance. That's another example where I might use the poke root, against heightened immune surveillance against things happening in the body, for example. And then if we look at for example, the medicinal mushrooms, yeah, I see them in the enhancer category, but I also see them a little bit in the immune tonic category. And again, a lot of the medicinal mushrooms were immune tonics. So again, that person who's catching infections all the time or wants to enhance their immune surveillance, I'll give them medicinal mushrooms. Now, if we look at allergy, I believe there's value in working on the immune system in allergy. Yes, we have our anti-allergic herbs. So we have albizia and Bicol skullcap and black cumin seed as wonderful anti-allergic herbs. But in addition, I might want to enhance the immune system and indeed modulate it with, say, echinacea and medicinal mushrooms in an allergy. So that's a fairly broad-based illustration of how you apply that knowledge clinically.
You carry kind of that thoughts of allergy and immune and maybe how they work in parallel, right? We often see somebody who tends to have more allergies are more susceptible to other things and maybe have more inflammatory response. So I think that's an important thing to distinguish, right? And point that out that you really need to address that with those type of patients.
Indeed, indeed, and we know that mushrooms, for example, when I prescribe medicinal mushrooms in a supplement, I also encourage the patient to have mushrooms in their diet as well,
Mhm.
because there are certain cellular structures in mushrooms that are best replicated through dietary intake that have an impact on particular receptors known as dectin-1 receptors. And more recently, for example, they've discovered that dectin-1 receptors play a role in regulating allergic responses. So, it's all part of the same picture. And I think a lot of the reservations people have about immune herbs come from rather simplistic, one-dimensional concepts about what the
Mhm.
immune system is. But the immune system is a network. It's hugely, hugely complex. So we've got this massive, massive network, and we're just going in and applying subtle influences here, there, and wherever in this network, and it's extraordinarily complex, but wonderful in the way these herbs seem to, in general, with the exception, as I said, of the things like poke root, uh, seem to always act in harmony. So even if you gave, again, with the exception of poke root, if you gave the wrong herb to someone, you're not going to do any harm. You're not going to
Mhm.
rev up their autoimmune disease. You're not going to make their allergy worse, and you're certainly not going to wear out their immune system.
Mhm. Maybe we can touch a little bit on how the herbs are impacting both innate and adaptive. And maybe it would be good just to define those two terms because I
Yeah,
think I want to make
yeah.
sure that people really remember what they are because, in your mind, sometimes they get confused.
Yes. So when a pathogen comes along and takes hold in your body, um, your immune system needs to act and act quickly. So the first part of its response is the innate immune response. And with the innate immune response, the immune system reacts by inherently recognizing either changes and damage to cells that pathogen is causing in a particular way, often coupled with a recognition of particular molecular patterns that pathogen has that can no way be misinterpreted as being self. So we have these things, toll-like receptors and so on, that are called pattern recognition receptors, and they recognize the molecular patterns of pathogens that are quite different to our own tissues. So we have this inbuilt immediate response, an innate immune system. And it's quite interesting that plants, even organisms like plants that are lower down on the biological scale, in that animals are considered to be more evolved and so on and so on. But even plants have an innate immune system. But then, certainly in invertebrates, we have a more sophisticated immune response that comes later, which is our adaptive immune response. And our adaptive immune response involves generally the production of antibodies from the B lymphocytes or heightened cellular killing from the T cells. So the adaptive immune response kicks in 4 to 7 days after your innate immune response. And the important thing here is that if you didn't first have an innate immune response, you wouldn't get an adaptive one, because the innate immune response triggers the adaptive one. You can't get an adaptive immune response in general without first getting an innate one. So innate triggers adaptive. And the other important point to consider is, if you didn't have an innate immune response, you'd probably be dead before your body had time to do an adaptive one. So the innate,
Right.
sets in a holding pattern. So, hey, we're going to stop these guys right now, while you learn what to do in a more sophisticated and targeted manner. But we're just going to blast them right now in an unsophisticated way to keep them under control. So the question arises, and I've actually seen papers written by people who are, very erudite and researched in the field, who say it's a myth that any herbs have any impact on the immune system, because it's all based on test tube experiments and it's all artificial and so on, and a lot of it's due to bacterial contaminants that come with the herb that are stimulating the immune response. So that's one extreme perspective. Till we get to the point where some people believe that the immune system is, so focused and able to influence the adaptive immune response that it's going to disrupt the Th1 Th2 immune balance in your body and make some diseases worse. So we got these two extreme perspectives: no effect on immunity at all, and profound effects on the adaptive immune response. But I believe the truth is more in the middle, and that is, I believe that herbs largely act on the innate immune response. And it kind of makes sense, because if you look at plants have an innate immune response. And you may think that I'm being a bit flaky, but a lot of those pathways, those signaling pathways that plants use, are preserved in our cells. It's just that the things that happen downstream are different, but the things that initiate the signaling and kick it off are very, very similar. So I believe, because plants have an innate immune response, their action in the human body is largely on heightening the innate immune response. And this has led to
Mhm.
misunderstandings, because they've mixed echinacea in test tubes with immune cells, and they see heightened cytokine responses, and they say, oh my God, don't give echinacea in a viral infection or any sort of sepsis type, because it's going to stimulate cytokine storm, because look, it's raised cytokines, so it's a given. Whereas in fact, what the echinacea and these other herbs are doing is they're only triggering small amounts of cytokines, because the cytokines are the language of the immune system that facilitate both the innate and adaptive immune responses. So that they're actually, all that shows is their sphere of action, which is on the innate immune system. So that's where I believe herbs work, and that's why I use that example that you can use something like echinacea root, which I believe there's pretty profound evidence that it stimulates the innate immune response, in conjunction with herbs that might suppress or slightly depress the immune system, like hemidesmus and buplurum. That's why I believe you can credibly combine the two in an autoimmune disease, because often in autoimmunity, see, autoimmune disease is a disease of the adaptive immune response, not innate. I believe the innate immune response is sick, it's unwell in autoimmune disease, so it needs to be boosted, and that's what the echinacea root will do. And the adaptive immune response is overactive, obviously, in autoimmune disease, and it needs to be calmed down, and that's what the hemidesmus and buplurum will do. So to me, that kind of, it has a logic to it, even though it at first it might seem like paradoxical.
No, I think it totally makes sense, and if you kind of get to the root of it, right, and
Yeah,
how the immune system responds, and I know you and I had a maybe it's probably been a year and a half ago or a year ago when we kind of started this whole podcast series. We had a real in-depth conversation about the cytokine storm and echinacea.
we did.
Uh,
We
yeah,
did.
and so we'll refer people back to that because if you're
Yes.
still thinking about that, it was a really nice conversation. So one kind of last thought is on the impact of herbs on Th1 and Th2 and the immune balance there. Can you address that a little bit?
Yes. So I think perhaps there's another thing I should say first, and that is that
Sure.
people might come back to me and saying, "Hey, you're saying the sphere of action of most herbs is on the innate immune response. We can exclude pokeroot, which is definitely acting on T cells and lymphocytes." Um, you're saying that, but hey, I know there are experiments where they gave sheep echinacea, and then they injected antibodies, and the antibody responses of the sheep were heightened. So isn't that echinacea working on the adaptive immune response, because antibodies are part of the adaptive immune response? And it's true, and those experiments are done, and the results are there and they're valid. But that doesn't mean to say that the pathway is a direct effect on the adaptive immune response. I believe that herb like echinacea is heightening the innate immune response and thereby facilitating a better adaptive immune response, and that's why the antibody was improved. So it's via that. It's not a direct effect. So, but this concept that herbs might act directly on the adaptive immune response has created, I think, a very great misdirection in how people think about how to use herbs clinically. And that is, they believe that herbs will disturb their Th1, Th2 immune balance, because Th1 and Th2, Th1 cell mediated immunity, Th2 antibody mediated immunity. So
Hmm.
I don't think that's robust at all. And furthermore, I would put that it's quite dated. For starters, and if we look at autoimmune disease, it's not just Th1 cells, they play a role in autoimmune disease, but mainly Th17 cells are the key cells in autoimmunity. And so they're ignoring a significant finding of science that's been around for a decade or two. But there's another significant finding of science that they're ignoring, and that is that acting above Th1 and Th2 are the Tregs. And I believe that certain herbs, via their effects on innate immunity, and particularly I think the mushrooms, for example, actually, and certainly, good fiber in the diet and healthy gut
Hmm.
flora and all of that, in boost your Tregs that are acting above Th1 and Th2. But the final point is that I don't think any of the data that suggests that this herb stimulates Th1, therefore I can't give it an autoimmune disease, or this herb stimulates Th2, therefore I can't give it an allergy. I don't think any of that science is sufficiently robust to extrapolate to a clinical situation. So I believe that is a complete misdirection. It should be completely expunged from herbal thinking. And I think what we need to focus on is these concepts of immune tonics, enhancers, stimulators, and sometimes depressors, those categories, with the understanding that we're not going to imbalance the immune system, except for perhaps stimulators and depressors if they're used indiscriminately, but certainly not with the immune tonics and enhancers. We're not going to imbalance the immune system. for starters, and we're certainly not going to see any adverse effects. And with the thought further that the main sphere of action of these herbs is on innate immunity.
Kerry, I think this was just really helpful for me personally to kind of like categorize in these four key areas as we think
Yeah,
about herbs and immune. And it really helps us kind of like put them into the right perspective. And so as we're thinking of it in a clinical way, it will help us then to, have the right kind of course of action for our patients.
absolutely. And I think this is a real strength. This is a
Hmm.
huge strength of herbal therapy, um, that I don't think is matched anywhere else. It's not matched by supplements. It's not matched, certainly not matched by drugs. Um, and the fascinating thing is you can't turn some of these herbs into drugs because there's no one single active component, or in the case of echinacea root, where it might be the group of alkyl amides are active, if you take them out of the herb, they're totally unstable and wouldn't be
Hmm.
suitable as a drug anyway. So this is really the domain of herbal therapy, and it's just one strength. And if you if you find herbs challenging and what have you, just focus on this area because you'll get so much clinical benefit for your patients by playing to this really important strength of herbal therapy.
Well, Carrie, thank you so much for this robust discussion and this, continuing timely topic of immune support. And I hope that our practitioners really have an opportunity to take this kind of clinical approach and apply it in their practice.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Medicinal Herbs podcast from Holistic Matters. Learn more about medicinal herbs and the immune system online at holisticmatters.com. That's holistic with a W.